to ProlesPod.
Welcome to ProlesPod, your bi-weekly dose of history, politics, and culture without the liberalism. As you may have heard, we're preparing to release our multi-part series on the life and lies about Joseph Stalin. Unlike the Legacy Proles' first pass on the subject, which premiered on Rev Left Radio nearly 6 years ago, this series will span several episodes, reflecting on the different periods of Stalin's life, his thoughts and decisions during those times, and the global historical context in which he lived. We do this work, of course, because we love it, and also because we believe a correct Marxist-Leninist analysis of history is of vital importance, both for understanding our role in a global communist lineage, but also to accurately assess current events and therefore act in accordance with our principles. As you can imagine, this project and the podcast in general is a significant undertaking in terms of our time, energy, and resources, as we want to ensure that our arguments are clear and concise, our information is accurate, and the quality of our conversations is both enriching and entertaining. We could not and cannot continue this work without listener support. If uplifting a project like ProlesPod is in alignment with your values, we ask that you consider subscribing to our Patreon, which you can find at patreon.com/ProlesPod, where paid tiers start at just $5 a month. In addition to our bi-weekly episodes, you will find our Secret Speeches, which are companion episodes to the main feed, our Theory Beats project, where we break down critical pieces of theory into digestible parts set to music, and our Surprise Drops, which are bonus conversations, essays, and more on topics that don't fit neatly into our usual body of work. If contributing to ProlesPod financially isn't an option or a priority for you at this time, we totally understand. Our Patreon has a free tier as well, where you can find study guides to help you think more critically about our main feed episodes and to spark discussions with your comrades. You can also subscribe to us on any of the podcast catchers, give us ratings, review our show, follow our old asses while we figure out social media, and share with your friends. But for those of you who are willing and able to subscribe to one of the paid tiers, we've put together this little buffet-style episode to give you an idea of what's behind the Iron Curtain of the paywall. We hope you enjoy it, and we look forward to sharing the upcoming Stalin series, as well as many other episodes in the future. May the specter haunt your streets, and solidarity forever.
One thing that became very clear to me as Jeremy was talking was the fact that this history of European, of Christian, incredibly violent anti-Semitism is generally totally erased in modern discourse. If we do see anything about Europe, of course, it's the Nazis. The Nazis are the ones who did terrible things to Jews. Everything else that other people did was more of like an annoyance rather than a genocide in this perspective. And what this reality gets replaced with is this false idea that Muslims and Arab people are really the ones who historically have oppressed Jewish people throughout time, and especially today, despite the reality being the exact opposite.
Yeah, and I've made reference to this text before, but there is a book that I read when I was getting my undergrad degree called The Chronicle of Bury St. Edmunds, which is a 10th or 11th century text where it talks about the town of Bury St. Edmunds, which is in the southeast of England, where there was literally a pogrom back in the late medieval period, right? The late Middle Ages or whatever. It's not a recent tradition that started in the 20th or the 19th or the 18th century. European anti-Semitism is very, very old and very ingrained in the identity of Europe. And it's not isolated to Eastern Europe. It was very common in Western Europe as well. That is the tradition of anti-Semitism, is this long legacy of Europeans oppressing Jewish people and then exporting them to Palestine so that they don't have to deal with them. You know what I mean? Like, that was the whole purpose.
That was the whole conceit. That was the whole thing. Is like, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here.
but it is a very idealist presentation of the conflict, not focused at all really at the material conditions, the goals of implementing capitalism versus socialism, right? As in, the communists want to do this to, say, for example, raise the living standards, right? Provide housing, to fight colonialism, etc. None of that is mentioned. And the capitalists, even on their part, it's not really explained what their driving material rationale is, besides, we don't like communists.
That's really the point of empire, right? Because if we are to unpack socialism and the political vision, even just as an idea, even if it's in a piece of media to demonstrate how it did not live up to that, if that's the argument that they want to make, we can't actually, it's so scary to present Westerners with a fair and balanced, rational explanation of what the project of socialism is or does, because then we would also be tasked with explaining why people were against it, which are there Vietnamese people because of their material conditions, because of the propaganda that they experience, because of their, their own personalities and opinions who are and were anti-communist? Yes, absolutely. But we would have to explain that exactly like what you said. There is one clear political vision, and then the other one is just not that. We want geostrategic power in this place, and we don't want too much of that thing that you just explained, right? And we can't even present a Western audience with the notion. We can't even gesture vaguely at what it could be.
A bunch of goofy fucking anecdotes about trying to kill Castro in the book.
Yeah.
They had one where, the
wetsuit, right?
The fucking wetsuit, which is so hilarious because they poisoned this wetsuit, and then the guy that was giving him the wetsuit just gave him another wetsuit.
So who found the poison wetsuit then?
It got destroyed or whatever. So there's actually, that's a whole other thing, is all these poisons, where they ended up. But there was
which
another one
then becomes a plot line in Harry Potter.
Oh shit. There's another where they, the plan was to put an explosive device in a rare seashell because Castro liked to go deep sea diving or whatever. And they were so they developed this whole plan with the shell, with the explosive. And then they were just wait a minute, this is totally impractical. How the hell are we going to get him to go in this specific spot, find this specific shell, pick it up, and then blow up? Stupid shit. There's another where they poisoned cigars, right? A bunch of fucking cigars, to the point that if it touches his lips or whatever, he's gonna, instantly die. And then, they end up not even getting it close because the guy who was supposed to deliver it ended up getting busted long before he even got close to Castro. There's another where they were going to feed him LSD, Castro, while he was giving a speech so that he would sound incoherent, and then the people would rise up and be like, this guy's crazy.
When we listen to Biden.
Right? There's another where they, like Samson, they thought that his charm was in his hair and his beard. And so they developed this poison that would make his hair fall out. And then everybody would laugh at him because he was hairless, and then they would overthrow the government. These are the ideas that the CIA didn't just come up with, but actually fucking developed. They developed this hair loss poison. What?
In the multiverse, there's another world where, Castro experiences all these assassination attempts, and they all actually happen. He gets a poisoned cigar. He just smokes it.
Right? Yeah.
He loses his hair.
Yeah. And you find out he has a perfectly shaped head, and he's like Mr. Clean.
It becomes a trend, and all the bald kings are free to walk around in Cuba as the fashionistas they are.
Yes.
Hell yes.
That's the world I want to live in. Yeah.
It's the world Jeremy wants to live in.
That's definitely the one I want to live in.
I will add maybe a little wrinkle to this.
Boo.
So, Ray, can you quote that sentence again? It was the imperialism will lead to radicalization. What was the specific line?
Imperialism brings the working class to revolution.
brings working class to revolution. Okay, the wrinkle I'll add to this is the Ray's giving me a thumbs down for those who can't see us right now, is that in the 21st century, the level of propaganda, the sophistication of it, its ability to infect every kind of second of our lives, pro-capitalist propaganda.
Along with, I presume, the increase of militarization, surveillance, and carcerality in general.
100%. I mean, all those things can be radicalizing, but that you've just mentioned. But it's like, in terms of just like the propaganda aspect of it, it's just that it's so intense that perhaps that isn't a necessity that imperialism will do that, because part of imperialism is the propagation of imperialist propaganda, which, supports the system, justifies the system.
But I think alongside that and concurrently with that is the crisis of the climate. And eventually, this is what I'm saying when I say it's like an inevitability. Even if we're all fucking dead, eventually some of the capitalists will then become proletarianized in this consolidation of power with minimal resources. And even if it's like former billionaires or whatever, like are now the proletarians against these like ultra billionaires. That's what I'm saying. It's like, I might not be there for it, but I think one, the revolution, because of the limits of imperialism, is an inevitability. But to all of your points, I don't know that that means the revolution is a socialist revolution, but the order cannot continue.
I understand.
Well, and also, in terms of propaganda can only be effective insofar as reality reflects the propaganda, even if it's to an extremely limited degree. So, not to, again, content warning, I'm about to quote Foucault here, but he says that
more like Buco.
Yeah, I mean, he's a neoliberal shithead, but, whatever. In the 60s, he wrote some okay stuff. There are opportunities for change to happen when institutions begin to break down, and institutions break down when the foundation on which they are built, let's say propaganda, because there is no firm foundation for the liberal order. Like it doesn't really have anything underneath it that fundamentally means anything. It is an ideology built on ideals and not, material reality. But the propaganda that underlies it, if the lies of that propaganda are shown to be lies, and it's obvious because of the way that the system is expressing itself, there are opportunities there for incursions and changes that can take place. And he was not obviously talking about revolution directly, but we are. And I think that is true, that the propaganda can only be effective if at least some people believe it is true based on the things that they see around them. And if they see that it is all false, that if they see that, I'm not seeing any return on my hard work, so that's not true. The people who are in power seem like they are the worst people imaginable, so the cream does not really rise to the top. These sorts of things, as they are revealed to be lies, I think there are going to be more and more and more opportunities for us to pull people away from liberalism.
Like I mentioned in the previous part, the Workers' Front of Latvia was also banned, and we make it to the Secret Service reports every year, and they referred to us as the Marxist Study Group.
Hey, we've got one of those. I was going to say, is there a lot of connection or solidarity between Russian communists and Latvian communists, or the Baltic states in general? What does that kind of look like?
Yes, there is connection. Well, obviously, I'm trying to maintain as many ties as possible, even though that is difficult with the Russian communists, because the nationalists are trying to shut it down for many reasons. Well, first of all, they're trying to instigate hatred between our peoples, both inside Latvia and outside, between those who are living in Latvia and those in Russia and Belarus, of course, because we have this very, very deep and ancient connection throughout history, because both the Baltic and the Slavic tribes were fighting together against the German Crusaders. as a single unified force. So we were trading, we were peacefully existing with one another. That is why one of the cornerstones of modern capitalist politics of Latvia is anti-Russism, and anti-Slavism. Everything that is related to the Slavic people, their language, their culture, their history, even though these people are native to the land just as much as the Latvians, it is all getting banned, limited, ostracized, and in order to keep this divide open, in order to keep this wound unhealed.
Second thing is, at least from the view of the propagandistic rhetoric that gets used when speaking about, if, say, for example, when the Soviet Union was around, they'd be sending advisors or scientists or whatever to assist some smaller developing country or even another socialist country, and they would be called puppets. Those countries where they send advisors would be called puppets for having those people helping them or assisting them. And it's like, if we're going by that logic, then
and what is the Ukraine? Yeah.
If Ukraine knew that the U.S. was going to do what it did to Afghanistan, like, why bet your existence on the U.S.? You already know how this goes. Like, they don't ever make anything better, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, at what point in history has the United States getting involved in your fucking country made it a better place, other than by some measure South Korea, because it needed to look good against North Korea, and West Germany because it needed to look good against East Germany. Like, otherwise, always fucked every single time.
Right. And that was mostly because of financial, like, infrastructure stuff, right? Not like military assistance and CIA shit.
Right. Although obviously
they did that too, but that's not what it's not what helped.
Yes, that's not what made these countries. That's not what made it great. It was dumping massive amounts of money into the overall systems of economics within that country, which is, shockingly, that's exactly what the Soviet Union did in the places that it went to, was to help build them up. But that makes you a puppet, versus the CIA being there does not.
There's a funny story about Acoustic Kitty. So one of the, like, harebrained schemes that these dummies came up with, so they realized that, like, oh shit, like, a cat's ear is actually really good at filtering out background noise, like a human ear. And
also in Harry Potter.
And so they, because they were struggling doing surveillance, because they'd put in like a mic or whatever and it wouldn't pick up shit because it was too much. There's too much background noise. It wasn't close enough, blah, 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 blah. Not to mention, the Soviets and stuff finding all these different planted devices. So they figured if they could put a listening device in a cat's ear, then they would be able to filter out all this background noise. Nobody would suspect this cat. And, they would get all this super cool intel. So they put this cat they implanted a listening device in his ear canal. And then they listened to it and they were like, oh, fuck yeah, this works great. And so they took it out to this park to, like, test how it was going to work. So they put the cat down, a handful of meters from this bench that these people were sitting on. And they were like, okay, like, let's go get this cat to go spy on these people at this bench. And anyone who
clearly they've never owned a cat before.
Yeah, clearly they've never even, like, seen a cat before because, like, you know what happened, right? They put the cat down. The cat was, like, sat down, scratched itself a little, and then walked off in a completely different direction, like, doing whatever the fuck it wanted because it's a fucking cat.
In the media, the backlash, at least in English language Western media, because Nguyen has also faced some criticism from Vietnamese language media, but in Western English language media, this is touted as a sympathetic portrayal of a communist.
And, like, maybe my lens is colored because I am a communist, that I will be sympathetic, that my own viewing of the show will be sympathetic regardless of that. And I think what they mean by sympathy is actually just, like, giving him some kind of, like, humanity as a communist, right? The sympathy
and
is
by humanity, you mean green eyes, right?
Yeah, No, seriously, right? No, that's actually a very good point, is that the sympathies is elevated to being like any other kind of person who has a political motivation for the things that they do. And it's like, that's, great, but that's like the lowest, I think, bar possible.
Except for he's not, I would push back against that. I don't even think he's seen as a character who has a political motivation for the things that he does. I think that we see him just as like a romantic philosopher. And we see, again, a version of so-called communism that is just conflated with authoritarian nationalism. And it's never explored in any way for any reason beyond that. And also, I think that if I didn't know anything about communism or Vietnam and I were watching this, I would just think that the captain was ideologically pulled between his two best friends. And he picked the one that, like, when they were children, seemed a little bit more sympathetic and had more common sense. But even the beginning monologue, right, is that it's like, this is my problem, is that I have too much sympathy. I have too much compassion. I just care too much about other people, which we'll get into in the section where I get to complain about how much I hated reading this book. But especially in the book, the protagonist is a detestable character. So he's not in the show. They make him much more likable in the show. But in the book, it's terrible. He's trash. Again, sort of like I said before, the protagonist is sympathetic because he sort of cosplays a bunch of American and Western ideas. I mean, we see this at the end of the show where the South Vietnamese army wants to come back and take Saigon. They all start to, like, for the most part, speak in English to one another. And this is really interesting, right? Because, again, is it possible that a group of immigrants from one place might choose to speak the language of the country that they're in? Sure, it happens. But for the most part, we all tend to speak our native language if everyone there speaks the same native language. But suddenly, when they're mobilized to take back Saigon, they want to take back Saigon basically as kind of like American Vietnamese people and not necessarily, or Americanized Vietnamese people, which I just thought was like quite an interesting thing. Also, I want to acknowledge that like an American audience still hates reading subtitles. And as much as I read several interviews with the author when he said, we tried as much as we could to keep as much Vietnamese language as possible within the show. But ultimately, there are certain scenes, for example, with the captain and Lana, where again, they're both native Vietnamese speakers. She went from being like a barely, maybe also as a person who, as an adult, has had to learn Vietnamese, and I know how hard it is. I know a lot of Vietnamese speakers who learned English. The idea that she went from being like barely conversational to fluent in like a few months, and now they're just having these like hard times in English. I know that there's an artistic reason and an audience accessibility reason, but given the actual political nature of what is being put forth in the show, I can't help but like notice that.
Not to mention the fact that the humans never really acted in self-preservation as much as they acted in extermination. And then, a bit like Israel, get mad when somebody tries to fight back.
Yeah, hierarchy maintenance kind of thing.
I mean, that's exactly what I think the U.S., would do. They would do like the, like Snowpiercer. They would just do the stupidest thing you could possibly do, and only like a fraction of people will survive.
That's actually what worries me about the future. Is that the U.S. is in rapid decline, and I feel like they're going to do some really stupid shit rather than just like go the way of the buffalo.
Right. Yeah. There's what was that? Don't Look Up, that like Netflix movie.
Oh yeah.
Never watched it.
It was annoying to watch because in reality, what would happen is China would deal with it by themselves. Without the help of the United States, if they could, like as soon as something like that happened, they'd be like, all right, we're going to go fucking blow it up like immediately. And of course, it's a fucking lib movie. So it's all about how the United States responds to everything. And then they extrapolate that to the rest of the world. Yeah. And Orange Man bad. This is a reading of the poem Kids Who Die by Langston Hughes. This is for the kids who die, black and white, for kids will die certainly. The old and rich will live on a while, as always, eating blood and gold, letting kids die. Kids will die in the swamps of Mississippi, organizing sharecroppers. Kids will die in the streets of Chicago, organizing workers. Kids will die in the orange groves of California, telling others to get together, whites and Filipinos, Negroes and Mexicans. All kinds of kids will die who don't believe in lies and bribes and contentment and a lousy peace. Of course, the wise and the learned who pen editorials in the papers, and the gentlemen with doctor in front of their names, white and black, who make surveys and write books, will live on, weaving words to smother the kids who die, and the sleazy courts, and the bribe-reaching police, and the blood-loving generals, and the money-loving preachers will all raise their hands against the kids who die, beating them with laws and clubs and bayonets and bullets to frighten the people. For the kids who die are like iron in the blood of the people, and the old and rich don't want the people to taste the iron of the kids who die, don't want the people to get wise to their own power, to believe in Angelo Herndon, or even get together. Listen, kids who die, maybe now there will be no monument for you except in our hearts. Maybe your bodies will be lost in a swamp, or a prison grave, or the potter's field, or the rivers where you're drowned like Liebknecht. But the day will come, you are sure yourselves that it is coming, when the marching feet of the masses will raise for you a living monument of love, and joy, and laughter, and black hands and white hands clasped as one, and a song that reaches the sky, the song of the life triumphant through the kids who die.
And then to go back a little bit to the Jumbotron thing, after one of the preseason games, they pull in one of the girls and they show the shot of like a zoom in on her. And they're like, what do you see wrong with this picture? And she's like, I don't know. And they're like, the bag's under your eyes. You need more makeup. Gosh. So they are zooming in on this girl's eyes, and then afterwards being like, "Yo, you need to put more makeup on that shit."
Again, could not get footage of one of the teammates being assaulted. Which, by the way, she was assaulted by a cameraman. So I'm like, how is there not footage of that? There were cameras.
There is.
But they found the bag under a presumably 22-year-old's eye.
Yeah.
I guess maybe coming into our final TSS question, I think that there are a lot of people, I know them myself, who, again, as I mentioned in the main feed episode, favor this kind of anti-state Marxism, so-called anti-state Marxism, and they're afraid of sort of falling in line under a party. I mean, even when Stalin lays out this pretty nuanced relationship with extra party or outside of the party organizations and their role, they're still sort of subservient and dictated to by the party. And I think that that scares a lot of people. I'm one of them. I don't know. What do we do about that? I think that people are scared of subservience to the party. And I think that there are a lot of people, myself included, who are really critical of the material moment of the supposed like withering away of the state. And I think that for Marx, for Lenin, for Stalin, they sort of like kind of kick that can down the road. And I don't know, I could be wrong. I'm not here to pathologize people, but I think it's like kind of challenging when you're a person or a part of a movement with a lot of power to imagine the day that ceases to be the case. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that.
I mean, I think the materialist answer is that the state arose for material conditions and the state cannot go away until those material conditions are resolved. I think the state is unlikely to go away, and sort of the hierarchical structure of the party is unlikely to go away until such time as at least socialism becomes the dominant economic system globally, if not hegemonic. Like you can't the state exists for a reason, and there are security concerns that you desperately need addressed as long as capitalism and imperialism exists anywhere else in the world. Like, it's going to continue to try to undermine your project, and it'll do it in overt ways and it'll do it in covert ways, and you need some kind of central authority to address those problems. And it sucks because the state sucks. Like, I am staunchly a Marxist-Leninist, and I believe in the worker state and the dictatorship of the proletariat as expressed in its various forms in actually existing socialism. But I am also keenly aware of the fact that states cannot address issues on a case-by-case basis. It is impossible for it to function in that way. It must have sweeping, overarching methods of addressing problems, which means that people who don't deserve it get crushed underfoot. And that is a thing that's going to happen. And it is very shitty that it does. But the alternative is the project itself collapses and we just have capitalism for fucking ever. So it is a transitionary period, but how long it's going to take, I don't know. A long time, I imagine. But, you know, I guess we'll see. The CIA has kind of like managed to launder its image to some degree so that it has escaped criticism on any significant scale. Like, I think that's a good point. Like,
no, more than anything, like the branding of the CIA is baffling how they can, and it's also done through like the Department of Defense. To my knowledge, the Department of Defense's like entertainment division, that they can portray themselves as like very like capable. When, as with stories like this one, you see that it's an organization that's just like hanging on by jingoism and duct tape.
Yeah.
Then that is quite wasteful and it does not accomplish its objectives at any point.
Yeah, I mean, one of the projects that came up during this phase of like early MK Ultra was the CIA sending Kermit Roosevelt in to overthrow Mossadegh, and he failed the first time. He was given like $1 million, which I'd have to like put it in a calculator to figure out how much that is in today's money, but a significant amount of money that he took over there to try to foment a coup against Mossadegh, failed, came back to the United States, got double the money, went back and was successful. And that's the thing about the CIA. It's not that they're incredible. It's not that they never make mistakes. It's that they have unlimited resources to throw at a problem. They spent $2.8 million on a tiny amount of LSD, but that doesn't matter because they could just go to Eli Lilly and pay them to make more. Like it is an unbelievable organization. Like, it is unfathomable how much money they waste failing, but they have an unlimited supply, so it doesn't matter.
Well, so something to like keep in mind, we always talk about like the contradictions between the US perception of socialist countries or whatever, but like, people are always like, oh yeah, the USSR, like all the media is state sponsored, blah de fucking blah. But the same is true more or less about the US. So any movie, show, whatever that has the name, the logo, the equipment, the hardware, whatever of the image of any US military government structure has to get approval to use it from the U.S. government.
By the DoD entertainment division.
Exactly, which means that they cannot make something that is so scathing to the U.S. that it would actually impact public perception. Otherwise, they're not allowed to use, the U.S. Army logo or whatever.
They can use previous iterations of this stuff. They can use, they can do historical stuff, but if they do, they have to pay for it themselves. Whereas if they get approval in advance from the army, if they're like, oh, here's the script, here's what we're going to do, here's our plan, they can get that shit for free from the military. The military will send them old Hueys. They will send them old Vietnam era uniforms. They will fund it themselves if the movie production company paints them in a positive light. Yeah. It's wild. This pattern was also not exclusive to Ukraine. Iskalot talks about it in the Latvia episode I think he said in Lithuania they declared it a Jew-free nation because they had executed or displaced so many Jewish people. Which was on the study
guide for those of you keeping up with that.
Yeah. But same in Latvia, same in Moldova, same in Belarus. They all had these periods of massive waves of pogroms.
Yeah, and if these pogroms hadn't happened and all of these Jewish folks had lived, the West would have fucking hated it. So, they can wring their hands all they want, but they are so glad that they murdered all these Jews, because then they don't have to deal with as much of, the left-leaning socialist, pro-Soviet bloc.
About whether Magneto would be portrayed as a villain or not, whether he would do the unthinkable and there'd be no turning back for him. Thoughts?
Okay, so should we maybe just start talking about how it ended? Because to me, I thought it kind of sucked. They built Magneto up to be this kind of he's kind of synthesizing his tactics with a little bit more well thought out Professor X style relating to the material conditions he's in, rather than just wild ass shit. And then he fucking turns off the entire world, right? He just goes full supervillain, asshole. And then he has to be mind healed by Professor X in order to not be angry anymore, in order to fix everything. And to me, I thought that was kind of a bummer ending.
Yeah. So I guess on one end, so what happened is that Magneto, using his magnetic powers, was able to, turn off all the electricity functioning around the world. And he did this in response to the Prime Sentinels. That's kind of the context in which he's doing this. The Prime Sentinels have been ignited or whatever.
Activated.
They've been activated. Thanks, Evan. They've been activated. And they're just wrecking shit on mutants across the world. So it's kind of
what's he supposed to do?
What's he supposed to do? Yeah. It'd just be oh, damn, that sucks. We're all getting killed. Damn. He had to do something, and that's what he chose to do.
And humans would have been pissed off if he didn't do anything, right? They're going to be pissed off no matter what.
Yeah. I feel like it stuck with his ethos. I don't think at any point... It
was consistent.
Yeah, I don't think at any point they pushed him into the supervillain that we were talking about, or how you mentioned. He did everything that he could, the only stuff that he could, to protect the mutants. And while he knew that by doing so, he risked destroying humans, he didn't do it maliciously. He didn't do it intentionally. It was literally the only course of action that could save them all. And if he had to choose between mutants and humans, he chose mutants. And I think that that is demonstrated, justified, I guess, by the fact that Rogue went over. Like, to me, that was the signal of like, this is some new shit, right? It's not Rogue going evil. It wasn't, Sunspot going evil. It was them being like, X is not going to give it to us.
Earlier we were talking and you said something about feeling like we didn't know what to do with the Patreon money that was coming in because we kind of didn't expect to be successful. And then suddenly we had all this money and it had never occurred to us that like we have to do something with it. But then spending it felt really bad. And obviously like the girl boss life coach in me was like, what? No, that sounds great.
Yeah.
And you were like, yeah, I think we had some like kind of weird things that we hadn't really thought about. And it kind of had this like neoliberal tinge to like what was going on.
Yeah, I think that it's a combination of a few different things. There was the reality that most of us were white guys from well-to-do families, or at least decently well-to-do families. And so there's always this kind of almost Calvinist sort of, we work, we must work, we work hard, and that's that. And maybe because of that, because we view work only as like the sense of manual labor or selling your body sort of thing, that we had a aversion to using our platform to pay ourselves. And I think that part of that is like also intrinsic in the nature of the left, because we are meant to be charitable, which is, of course, true, right? We are charitable with our time and energy and a million other things. But there's this idea that any sort of activism or what have you does not need to be compensated for. You should be doing it out of the goodness of your own heart. And like, how can you say you hate capitalism while you use an iPhone or whatever, right? And I guess that like that kind of is part of what I meant. There's the idea that by taking money to help ourselves, that we would somehow maybe sell out basically. Like we would just start doing stuff for the money.
Sell out to big Patreon.
Exactly. Sell out to big Patreon.
Bought by big subscribers.
Yeah. And then there was like always this weird hiccup of like, what do we do to account for the past? Like, do we just be like, oh, well, we have like all this money now, let's just move forward? Or do we be like, well, Justin and Ethan, put in a bajillion hours for months and months and months. Do we compensate them for that? Or do we just move forward? You know what I mean? Like there was always this kind of weird thing and nobody really wanted to talk about it. And and I just felt, I guess, uncomfortable talking about it once I had brought it up. I don't know. It was a weird thing and it's a thing that I think is sweeping, right? You see it anytime any sort of leftist makes any sort of money doing anything. It's the immediate thing that everybody jumps on. Like, what are you doing taking money? You don't have any business doing that. Like you should be working 40 to 60 hours a week and adding another 30 to 40 hours of podcasting.
You're also working 40 to 60 hours a week doing some kind of like hard labor job, right? I mean, something that really costs a lot of people, not to trivialize people who put in long hours doing other kinds of work.
Of course.
But I mean, the expectation is like you're supposed to be very extremely working class and also have time to raise your family and read theory. And of course, like I've talked about it before, revolutionaries of the past absolutely had to do that. And again, I don't want to diminish that or say that there's no place for it, but also just having that as an expectation is just kind of unfounded and unfair.
We can't rob trains anymore, right? And
question mark?
Yeah. I guess like this as a really long answer.
Surprise drop live from the train car.
Yeah, that'd be fucking awesome. But like it really like upsets me, I guess, because I feel like it would have allowed us to do so much more if we just would have been like, what the fuck are we doing?
Right.
And it probably would have relieved a lot of the stress that ended up, you know.
I see this a lot, right? As somebody who bridges like podcasting, and like I also have a small business, and the way in which we're just all sort of like, there are so many industries. I have a lot of clients who are therapists, who are nurses, and they also do a lot of like feminized labor, which I would say, even though the podcastariat is often men, entertainment on aggregate often skews toward being sort of like feminized or queered labor. And the way that these industries are automatically assumed that we should do them for the love of it, that we should do them and live in precarity, that we should be giving of ourselves, even when we ourselves do not have enough. I know in the instance of receiving money through the Patreon for Proles, like you did have money in that moment, and that was kind of the conflict. But I think that there is like a very neoliberal ethos that like filters its way there, often under the guise of like wokeness or the value of identity, which I do think has value. I don't know. Tony, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, so this is maybe a bit ironic, but say if we take a look back at the 20th century countries, actually existing socialist countries of the 20th century, what we see there is things like the arts, whether that's writing, whether that's, singing, dance, whatever the hell it is. Those things could actually function as viable careers for people in the Soviet Union, for example, right? And in our current neoliberal system, like you literally, for the most part, cannot make even a remote living.
Yeah. I mean, they had like villages for writers and shit so that all the artists would be in one area and they could feed off of each other and encourage each other or whatever. Yeah, that's a great point. I was also going to say, like, yeah, I mean, it was so weird. It's such a weird thing. But like my car broke at one point, right? And we have four, now one of them's out of the house and one of them's almost out of the house. But at the time we had 4 kids, and my wife and I both working full time. And we had one car because my car was out of commission because I couldn't afford to fix it for like months. I mean, months and months and months and months and months. And that just like looking back on that, it's like, what the fuck, man? That shit's crazy.
Right. I agree. And the idea that we should live in further and further and further precarity, or I don't think that like the guilt about it is particularly generative or helpful. And I think at the end of the day, I'm a socialist because I think everyone deserves to live with dignity.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you as an individual sacrificing your dignity for the sake of an ideal gets us closer to that.
Yeah. It was dumb.
We were stupid. I didn't mean to put it against you. I just think that there are probably a lot of people listening who face very similar decisions. And it's important to understand the ways in which the neoliberal obsession with the individual, not that we don't have sovereignty or that we don't have power as individuals, of course we do, but the equation of like me as the individual and my personal preferences, my choices, my actions, just me by myself with these finite resources is the thing that is going to challenge or rectify capitalism and existing structures of power, which maybe in very small ways, in very specific moments can be a part of your practice and praxis. I think it should be, but on aggregate is not the thing that's going to tip the scale. It's literally why we're revolutionary MLs.
Everything that I'm hearing from mainstream media, right? Which wall to wall is sort of blasting what is today the narrative of the pro-independence camp, which says that actually Taiwan is not part of China, has never been part of China, and is like radically culturally and ethnically distinct from China, right? So that leads to the question of like, how did we get here from there, right? From this Cold War narrative. For that, we have to look into the particular conditions of the end of the martial law period in Taiwan and the political monopoly of the Nationalist Party, of the Kuomintang or the KMT, which basically coincided with the end of the Cold War. where we left off sort of politically was talking about how the U.S. normalized relations with the People's Republic of China in 1979. As a result of that, it stopped recognizing the ROC, the Republic of China in Taiwan, as the legitimate government of all of China, and nominally recognized the PRC as that instead. But it continued to arm Taiwan to the hilt, right, and to maintain extensive economic and informal ties to the regime in Taiwan. But sort of almost simultaneously with this, you had major political transformations on both sides of the Taiwan Strait, right? After the death of Mao for example, in 1975, Chiang Kai-shek died in Taiwan, still pining for the mainland, to his dying day, hoping to retake it militarily. And then the year after, in 1976...
Did his girlfriend have a picture of Mao, like Trotsky's girlfriend had a picture of Stalin?
That would have been incredible. Yeah, I can't answer that question. But the upshot is Mao himself died in 1976, right? And this inaugurated major political shifts on both sides. Sort of after an interregnum, Chiang Kai-shek was actually succeeded by his son, Jiang Jingguo, in Taiwan, who, had been his henchman as leader of the secret police, right? But who, as president, kind of discovered, a more sort of quasi-liberal and reformist side of himself, where having sort of safely disposed of the pro-unification left and communist opposition, he instituted more political space for the liberal opposition to take its place, right? To take its place in that political vacuum as sort of de facto a controlled opposition, right? Which, had no allegiance at all to communism, was completely on board with Western liberalism, and whose only real main point of difference with the nationalists was that they did not really identify as much with, or at all really, with China, with the project of reunifying China. And in fact, their social base was the Benshenren, right? These Han Chinese who had lived in Taiwan for centuries longer, and they actively cultivated the sense of separateness, right, at a cultural level, which eventually was a vector into pro-independence political agitation. So that's what we have in Taiwan. Meanwhile, in mainland China, almost simultaneously with Jiang Jingguo, actually, Deng Xiaoping rises to power and inaugurates this process of reform and opening. And as part of that, you have at an initial sort of like halting level, more exchanges between the two sides of the strait. Obviously, they don't, and they still don't recognize each other as like legitimate political entities on paper. But like you have a marked shift in tone where on the mainland side, you have repeatedly throughout the 70s and 80s, and in a way that actually has been sustained until now. These offers to reunify with Taiwan on terms that are very favorable to Taiwan, right? That allow it to retain, a lot of its sort of now distinct economic and political characteristics, that allow a substantial degree of autonomy under, what has since become known as the one country, two systems arrangement, right?
Sure, like Hong Kong, like Macau.
Yes, exactly. And it was actually in the context of Taiwan that like one country, two systems was first proposed. It's just that Hong Kong and Macau, which were under British and Portuguese colonialism respectively, were, where it was first implemented. And indeed, a large part of the Western subversion, the Western imperial subversion efforts in Hong Kong specifically, which like culminated, in these mass protest movements of 2014 and especially 2019, was intended to force a crackdown, right, and to discredit the idea of one country, two systems, specifically to the electorate in Taiwan, so that they would their sort of pro-independence sympathies and the strength of the pro-independence camp would be sustained. But this kind of controlled liberalization that happens in Taiwan in the late 80s culminates in the ending of martial law in 1987, the legalization of other political parties, right? Of which the main one that becomes the principal opposition force is the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, which is like separatist, pro-independence in orientation, has its social base in the Benshenren, and is throughout the next several decades at various levels of Taiwanese society, really trying to push this narrative of Taiwan as culturally distinct, right? And therefore necessarily politically distinct from mainland China as well. And they're doing so, again, in a very favorable environment because the pro-unification left has been wiped out by the KMT. Quite rapidly, actually, even though the DPP itself remains in opposition, the guy who after the death of Jiang Jingguo in 1988, who takes over leadership of the KMT, right, of the Nationalist Party, which has this nominal commitment to reunifying all of China, including the mainland. He actually is a character that we introduced earlier, when we were talking about Japanization in Taiwan, right? This is Li Denghui. He is the first Taiwan-born leader of the island. He becomes chairman of the KMT, directly in opposition to the stated position of the party. As I mentioned, he spends his entire career basically promoting Taiwan localism, like overt political independence, promoting all these efforts of, the Taiwanese identity, quote unquote, that mark it as separate from that of the mainland. What this means is that, he is basically from the start consciously seeking sort of the sponsorship of the United States in this project. This leads to what's called the Third Taiwan Strait Crisis in 1995 and 96, which is when the U.S., in a violation of diplomatic protocol, gives Li Denghui a visa for an official visit to the United States, right? In a way that very much muddles the stated recognition by the United States of the People's Republic as the sole legitimate government of China. And so, this Third Taiwan Strait Crisis breaks out, involves military exercises by both sides. And that is sort of leading up to the 1996 election, which was the first direct presidential election in, the history of the ROC/Taiwan. Li Denghui is basically reelected to a new term. And after that, he very much intensifies this project of historical revisionism. It's really in that second term that he begins instituting a full-blown revision of history textbooks, which downplays, the impacts of Japanese colonialism and Japanese militarism, essentially treats every previous government in Taiwan, including the ROC itself, as like a string of colonial powers, right? Like going from Dutch and Spanish colonialism to, so-called like Qing Chinese colonialism to Japanese, and then to ROC, like, again, Chinese colonialism, quote unquote, right? And in fact, despite the fact that he himself, right, is nominally the head of the ruling party of the Republic of China, these textbook revisions essentially present the rule of the KMT during the White Terror period as more repressive and somehow more alien to Taiwan than the period of Japanese colonialism that preceded it.
After MK Ultra, they've been controlling, in quotes, people's minds by controlling the perception, the information that people get, and putting out the disinformation to make people think what they want them to think.
I think that there is a misconception about MK Ultra, which we didn't really talk about in the episode, which is that it really didn't have anything to do with drugs. That was the peripheral part.
Yeah.
The goal was to destroy people's minds in order to rebuild them.
Right.
And so they used drugs to assist that, but most of it revolved around torture. Like,
right.
like those people that were stuck in an isolation chamber for weeks on end, like nonstop tripping, like all of that stuff has nothing to do with drugs. It has to do with like just destroying your brain.
Right. Yeah. That was like I mentioned it briefly. The two questions that Gottlieb wanted to answer were, how much LSD would it take to destroy someone's psyche? And then can I overlay a new personality on that once I've destroyed the psyche? Which of course you can't. Like, that's not how brains work. Human brains develop over time and they take on, you can destroy someone's psyche. You can fuck it up really badly, but you can't put a new personality in there without spending years and years and years doing it. And you also can't do it to somebody who has been fucked up horribly by LSD.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
And we continue to see this. It's sort of like, so this sort of group of people who are like, oh, I wonder if we could do this thing. I bet the Soviets, I bet the communists are doing this thing. They have no evidence of it. They go for years and years and years, millions and millions and millions of dollars, all of these experiments, all of these lives lost and damage and families torn apart and all of these things. And then we still see it in media all the time. We're still looking for examples of like, this is the plot of Homeland. This is the plot of one of the characters of Scandal. This is the plot of one of the characters in the Hunger Games. Like, we will not stop telling this story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's as much secret speech as we can
You
muster.
guys enjoyed this episode.
Solidarity
Forever. Rae?
Goodbye. May the specter.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, y'all.
There we go.